G'day everyone. We're just going to wait a few more minutes, let a few more people come in. Hold with us. Hello everyone again, and welcome to today's webinar, Migrate to Office 365 Record and Compliance Without the Migraine. Thank you for taking time out and being here today. My name is Trevor Weir, a client executive with Prometix. Joining me today will be Ian Smith, our information and records management guru. Just a little housekeeping before we start. If you have any questions during the presentation, please type them into the question box in the GoToWebinar control panel. We'll bring them up during the presentation and also have a Q&A session at the end. And if you miss anything today, please contact us directly and we'll be glad to assist. Records management has been an integral part of organisational transformation. Organisations today have a greater focus on business continuity, particularly with the recent rush to adapt to remote working situations. Last year, Microsoft announced general availability of records management capability within Office 365 to help meet your legal, business, and regulatory record keeping obligations. Many organisations have seen the opportunity to leverage existing licenses to keep general business documents and business records within one platform as good business sense. It does make sense to leverage the out-of-box features in Office 365 and Compliance Centre features. The demand for these add-on products has seen ancillary products like records points being added to the Digital Transformation Agency approval list. Just going to show how valuable this new offering is, which is why I imagine you're all here today. You know the why, but the how is too great a headache. Today we'll learn how migrating to Office 365 can be undertaken easily, swiftly, and without disruption to your organisation. Today we'll discover how to successfully migrate your legacy EDRMS to Office 365 while ensuring your record keeping and compliance requirements are met. Experience a user-driven migration tool which completes the necessary target creation and migration tasks based on the user parameters provided and with the assistance of our experienced consultants. We'll look at some very cool features like suggestive approximation and silent mode that make migrations, well, free of migraines. Prometix is proud of the breadth of our partnerships, none more so than our Microsoft Gold partnership. We work with our state, federal and private customers, helping them get the most out of their Microsoft investment by enabling them to more easily use and share information as individuals and in teams. We design, implement, and support Microsoft technology solutions that align with our customers' priorities to deliver measurable and tangible positive outcomes. Prometix works across 5 key verticals, taking our customers through the entirety of a digital transformation and its ongoing management. Today, we'll be focusing on digital workplace and collaboration, with our discussions around migrating from Records Manager to Office 365 Records and Compliance. We'll walk through the migration options and our application lifecycle across 3 stages. 1, the initial assessment of your current EDRMS to generate the inventory of records, metadata, disposal schedules, and more. 2, we will then look at how to update the target Office 365 locations and make any changes in consultation with the organisation's records management needs. 3, finally, we look at migrating records and producing detailed migration reports and completing the cycle. Migrations can be complex, and we get it. We believe the first step of every digital transformation journey begins with a structured document and records environment. Whether you plan to lift and shift or take a more strategic approach, we'll support you on every step of your journey. Without any further delays, I'd like to invite our next presenter, our very own Ian Smith. Over to you, Ian.
Thank you for that, Trevor. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Ian Smith. This afternoon I'll be giving you a brief presentation about the record migration tool from your legacy application through to Microsoft Office 365. This isn't to suggest at any part during this demonstration that the Microsoft Office 365 suite is any better than the Micro Focus Content Manager, nor are we suggesting that you should move to Office 365 for record keeping. We assume that during and through your normal course of business and that decision-making process, you will ultimately decide what tools are best for your business. So without any further ado, let's take a quick look at this short video that will explain and describe the end-to-end process for record migration. Welcome to the Prometix Records to Microsoft Office 365 migration application. In this short video, we will cover the end-to-end process to migrate your records to Microsoft Office 365. The Prometix Records migration application is a simple to use yet sophisticated application that will make your migrations easy and painless. There are several things that you need to work through. Most notably is how you want your new records architecture to look and what you are expecting to achieve from this migration. The most notable and obvious outcomes are naturally all your documents and records in a single platform, allowing you to take full advantage of corporate OneDrives, personal OneDrives, SharePoint records management, and many of the other new services now offered by Microsoft Office 365. Of course, there is also the knowledge that your users all know and understand this platform, as it is already part of the standard Microsoft Office 365 offering. The first step in any successful migration is planning. There are a few things to consider in your plan, and this is an opportunity to configure your new record management capability to suit the needs of your users in a more holistic manner. Consider where you want to locate your records. Do you want to put all of your records into a single site collection, or do you want to use multiple site collections? Do you want all of your records in one library, or do you want to spread them out based on your existing record management system? Do you want to move all of your records to Microsoft Office 365, or just some of them? You can define many of the record characteristics that you want as part of your migration. You can also define how those records look and feel to the users once the migration is complete. There are several options and outcomes that can be obtained, and the skilled team at Prometix will walk you through this process and help you reach the outcome that suits your exacting business needs and the goals of your migration. Let's look at a simple migration from Trim Records Manager 8.1 using the demonstration data and migrate it to Microsoft Office 365. Having determined what our goals are, we need to then define those goals so the Prometix migration application can perform the migration tasks that we require. There are two major types of configuration: details about all migrations and the migration specific data, so the detail about the migration itself. I will explain the difference between these two configurations. Starting with the overall configuration, you will determine a number of things such as details about your content types, manage metadata and term store, site columns, and other default and security details within the application. These details are about your overall migration effort, and while they can be altered to suit the exacting needs of a migration, it is suggested that commonality is maintained within these configuration items, regardless of how you plan to migrate your record data. For example, there should only be a single term set that all records that are migrated refer to. The second is your migration profile. Each end-to-end migration has a profile which determines exactly what the Prometix application should do during this migration. And a full migration may have any number of profiles, which detail each of the various elements of the migration that make up the movement of all of your records to Microsoft Office 365. Unless you are doing a specific type of migration, or you want to break your migration into multiple sub-migrations, this is not usually something that you will need to consider. Start by defining the migration profile that you want to create or reuse. Because you can perform various steps in a migration independently of one another, meaning that your migration can receive input from a variety of record management experts with a specific focus on the various key elements of your migration, such as retention schedules, SharePoint architecture, security, and from the business users themselves. We need to provide the Prometix migration application with sufficient access to the record source and the Migration Office 365 environment to allow it to achieve its migration tasks. The next step is to select what source record containers we are going to process during this migration effort. You may select to do all your records, or just select some of your records in this migration. Using multiple profiles, you can see how you can create multiple migrations that all deal with different containers and records. In this demonstration, we are going to select all the containers and all of the records. We have finished with the source side of our migration and now need to follow our plan and set up or define our target within Microsoft Office 365. You may decide to move all of your records to a site collection or a sub-site within a site collection. Microsoft has defined a number of best practices, and of course, Prometix are always willing to help you with these decisions. As the features of Microsoft Office 365 evolve and change, so old features are phased out and new features come to being. Some of the older features, like information rights management, still present a valuable management feature for your records and documents. You may also continue to use those while they are supported by Microsoft. In this demonstration, we will not be using the information rights management feature. The next screen allows us to set up and implement our migration plan. We can now use a single library with a folder structure to match our record source. We can break the record source into various SharePoint libraries, or we can create our own unique mapping, which may be doing both things depending on our exacting business needs and the design or architecture of our SharePoint space. It doesn't matter which option you select. Clicking the Build Source Target Map button will provide the first of many configurations that can be customized to suit your needs. There is a wealth of already defined metadata in your source record management system, and we don't want to lose that. In this step, we will capture all of the existing metadata and create a configuration which allows you to easily redefine this in your new Microsoft Office 365 environment. Click the Build Metadata Maps button to capture all of this data. We will also need to define what our new site columns will be and how our users will interact with our data. Click the Build Content Type and View Map button to create a starting point for this process. Now we need to consider the retention labels that we are going to apply in the Security and Compliance Center of Microsoft Office 365. We can start with a new plan or have the Prometix migration application build a plan from the existing record source for us. This is a very convenient way to get this process started. We are nearly at the activity stage of the migration, but before we get there, we need to know if the logs are to be sent to a specific operator once these tasks are complete. This step is not essential if the operator is working with this workstation, as the logs are also locally available. This is where it starts to get really interesting and very, very exciting. We're at the activity stage of the process. If you do not execute a full migration which steps the Prometix migration application through each process required in turn, you will need to follow a specific process order here. We will do each individual step in this demonstration, so we won't be running a full migration, but we'll still achieve a full migration outcome. The first step will require that we have reviewed and completed our retention schedule data, and you would start by defining your retention schedules in Microsoft Office 365 Security and Compliance Center. Using the template from the migration application, this is an exceptionally quick and easy process. Simply upload the retention schedule created by the Prometix migration application to the Microsoft Security and Compliance Center, and that's it. Task done. At this point, we have two options. You can create an inventory which you can distribute to the users, allowing them to review and select which records do or do not need to be migrated, or you can create the SharePoint Online objects, such as term store, manage metadata, the lists and libraries, the content types, and the site columns that are required to host your source record data in Microsoft Office 365. Depending on the number of records and your configuration, these processes may take from a few minutes to several hours to complete. In this demonstration, we are going to start by building or deploying our SharePoint Online objects. Once this process is complete, you can see the term store items have been created, the library has been created, and it's populated with the content type and the site columns that we'll be using as our target for this migration. Now we can create our inventory. This will capture all of the source records and present them to us so we can select or deselect which records are included in this migration. The next thing we can do is the actual migration. Now we're ready to start copying our records from our source to our target Microsoft Office 365 SharePoint space. Once our migration is complete, you can see all of the records that are available, and we have a detailed report which identified any records that did not migrate and some troubleshooting information. Like all Microsoft Office 365 migrations, this migration will take some time to complete. If you are moving thousands of records or millions of records, then there will be a time gap between when the migration commences and the changes to the record source. This is where the Delta migration feature of the Prometix migration application comes in. The application knows exactly what actions were performed and when. It also knows when to check for updates, new records, or deletions from your record source. You can run as many Delta migrations as is necessary to create a seamless switchover from the old record source to your new Microsoft Office 365 record source. Let's create a Delta inventory and see how that process works. Now, let's run a Delta migration and see it update the records that we are working with. I hope you've enjoyed this short presentation. Thanks for watching, and remember that Prometix are here to help.
Is just quickly go through some of the detail that we saw in the video
and just perhaps provide a little more clarity and certainly a little more detail and perhaps a bit more information about some of the steps and some of the processes. And some of the key differences or some of the additional considerations that you'll want to take on board whenever we're doing a migration or whenever you're thinking about doing a migration. So some of the key takeaways that I'd like you to think about today are records to SharePoint, or moving records, migrating records to SharePoint. Once it's planned, it's not a particularly complicated task, but the trick here is the planning. So that needs to be done. But once it's done, execution is quick and easy. The configuration allows for data transformation rather than just a lift and shift. I think one of the things that we've learned in dealing with clients and customers and doing these migrations is that when we have a product, product X on the back end, we have to conform to meet the specifications of that requirement. When we actually really perhaps want something different, what this allows us, of course, to do is during that migration, it becomes more than that. It becomes more of a transformation. Let's make the data more usable. Let's put it where the users want it to be rather than just in this, one spot. And of course, some of the other things that you'll notice are that with SharePoint, of course, we have in-place records, which means that we don't necessarily have to consolidate everything into one spot. We can have it spread out, near and far. Excuse me. The other thing, of course, is that we can talk about configurable business rules. These make our migrations more of a do as I mean rather than, as I say, exercise. And what I mean by that is, and again, this is based on experience and history, we have scenarios that say the client wants a specific label designation or a specific title attached to a document, but that title may be a consolidation or a concatenation of a lot of different field elements. So we can actually set up business rules to do that, and we can do it on a per migration status. And what that effectively means is that we can take not just a whole, your entire record management system and apply that rule, but we can take small sections of it and apply different rules to different sections, which gives you this greater flexibility. Of course, when we talk about compliance, it's essential that during migrations, we do keep a record and we have good visibility over exactly what the status of each migration is. So we report every single effort, every single item that's touched and how that item has been touched. And that allows for that finite reporting at the end of it. The other thing too is that using the migration tool to complete a migration effectively means that we can adopt a phased approach. This becomes really important because what happens is that users like to have some sort of input. Now, it might be that we have different record keepers at different parts of the business, or we have different compliance requirements for different parts of the business. And so it's always good to touch those different stakeholders to make sure that they're engaged and they're aware of what's going on, but more specifically for their part of the experience. The other thing, of course, becomes something that the video talked about just right at the very end there, and that was the ability to sync your source with your target, because migrations can take a long time. And of course, there's also the human aspect as well in considering the different stages and phases of a migration. What can happen is that you might decide to migrate this container today, and then people will continue working on that container while you're moving other containers in the background. What the tool will do is it'll actually keep track of what it's done, what it's moved, when it moved it, and then it can go back and look for any changes in the records that it's already moved, and then make the appropriate adjustment to the SharePoint record as well. So these sorts of things here mean that we can set this tool up, we can work with you to get that planning process underway and started, and then we can actually start doing migrations without necessarily having completed the entire planning process for everything. So I think that that's really important. Let's break these down a little bit. Plan once and migrate in phases. The migration application allows stop-start migrations. Why does it do that? To ensure that all aspects of the migrations are agreed and considered by stakeholders, to ensure that the security of the record data that you're moving is maintained during the migration. That's really important. To allow consensus in the decision-making process. Again, by engaging stakeholders, we get to make sure that what we're doing is what the business really wants, right down to the stakeholder level. And we want to ensure that that migration is a collaborative process. One of the big issues, and I know I'm preaching to the converted here, but one of the big issues that I've always noticed in IT is that somebody will say to me, hey, Ian, we need you to build one of these. And I build one of these and the users go, well, we don't know anything about it, we're not using it. So what we try to do is we try to get user engagement. And the best way of doing that is by creating these collaborative exercises. We've also learned, and I've touched on this before, but we've also learned that migrations can quickly become transformations. And we actually really encourage that, because what we want to do is we want to create and provide that maximum value once the migration is done. And again, it doesn't matter whether you're migrating to a native SharePoint environment or you're going to use Record Point or any of those things. We consider all of those things post-migration. So we're just talking about getting the data from point A transformed into point B. The other thing too is that, and I've mentioned this again, we want to put that migration result in reach of the people that want to use that data. And this is why it's so important sort of to do this transformation exercise. What we can also do, and the video touched on this in a sort of roundabout way, and that is it talked about creating a single set of term store data. What we can do is that we can extract from your existing record management system all of the managed metadata that that system contains, and we can make it that single source of truth in SharePoint. Now, if you think about that for a second, what it means is that by transforming your records into SharePoint, it also means that all of that wealth of managed metadata also becomes available for the rest of the business. And that's something that we haven't had before. So that means that we do have this single source of truth in great detail. So let's look at the transformation. We don't want to lift and shift if we can avoid it. Of course, if that's the requirement, then we're happy to do that, but we think we can add much more value. You're about to move thousands of records, transform them into what you want them to be. So we can migrate to business functions, which is the sort of key to what we're talking about here. Part of our transformation is not necessarily just about picking up data and moving it in a lift and shift style arrangement. It can also be about migrating to the business function. And of course, I think that the adding diversity to your records allows those records to have greater end user value. And that's what I was talking about before my audio system completely went haywire. We want to facilitate both repository-based systems and in-place record management using the same metadata. And I touched on this just with the last slide. Again, SharePoint in the way that it operates allows us to have the best of both worlds. We can have standard repositories that we can put our records into, and they can be the domain of the record manager. As well as that, we can also have records that are out in the field that can be being used by our users, and they still facilitate that record, component. But the reality is that they're available to the users, which of course gives them greater value. We can configure the record types to be migrated in different ways. And of course, this is really important because part of that transformation needs to be very much along the lines of what best suits that type of record. How do we want to manage that class of record? Are we keeping this on behalf of a function or on behalf of a group of users? Or is it something that the users can also participate in the maintenance of? So there's that advantage too. What we might want to do in part of our migration is do all versions of these records, but not of these records. Again, that configuration is highly selectable, which means that we can really customize and tailor the movement of your records from a legacy system into SharePoint or Office 365. We can also break records into parts. One of the interesting things that we learned in doing this task for real was that organizations will have situations where the first 1,000 versions of record X was a PDF, but then it was changed to a Word document. And what happens is that you go ahead and you attach your Word document to the existing record structure, and everything seems to be fine until, of course, you go back to the version which had a PDF as the attached document. Now, in SharePoint, what will happen is that SharePoint uses the current record as the default MIME type for that record, regardless of what the version says. So we end up in a situation that says we now have a record with unreadable versions. So the way that we got around that was by automatically detecting a change in MIME type of any given record or its versions, and then by splitting that record into two unique records, part 1, part 2. And that allowed the users to look at the historical PDF versions as well as maintain and work within the existing Word documents as well. So again, that was one of those learn on the fly kind of things. So let's have a look at the records migration. More importantly, let's have a look at the configuration and flexibility. Phases of migrations can be based on record type, location of the record, a range of records, destination of the record in the new SharePoint environment, or things like record class. Existing record classes can be expanded or consolidated. Now, we found this was, again, this is an experience thing here. We found that part of the transformation really meant that users wanted to rethink how they were classifying their records and how they were grouping their records, how their records were put together and what made a record set, all these kinds of things. So this gave them the opportunity to revisit that stuff and redefine how their records were going to be classed or the classification as they were transitioned over to 365. Movement can be based on a record date, perhaps when the record was created or when it was last changed. And that one feature there is basically how the Delta migrations work. Multiple profiles allow for these characteristics to change from one set of records to any other set of records, or it can be on a record by record basis. If you're doing a couple of 100,000 records, that could take a while. So we try to encourage you to do groups at a time. So we can change the record class for this group of records, but keep it as is for this other group over here. So again, really diverse flexibility. We can migrate some records by ID. We can migrate others by class, others by date. And we can also determine where those records are going to end up in SharePoint as well. Remember that in the video, we talked about the different ways of distributing your records sort of in a post-migration world where we're not necessarily picking it up from, container A and plonking it into site collection B. What we can do is we can pick it up from container A, examine that record, look at the class, look at the characteristics of the record, look at the attributes of the record, and then make a determination where we want that record to go in the SharePoint environment. And it doesn't have to be one site collection, it can be multiple site collections. You can spread them out. Again, this comes back to that function-based sort of consideration. Let's have a look at the reporting side. So reporting is key to understanding what's happened in every migration effort, what happened to the records, did they migrate? If they failed, we like to identify exactly why they failed. One of the reasons why we've noticed that things fail is because there's a distinct mismatch between the structure in, say, Records Manager and, of course, some of the structures in SharePoint. So obviously we identify all of those things up front, but it might be that in part of the transformation we want to concatenate a whole bunch of data to create the title of the new migrated record. and perhaps that exceeds the allocation that SharePoint has allowed for that type of field. So if that's the case, what we can do is we can actually write business rules. So it'll fail on the first migration. We'll then identify what the issue is, and then we'll create a business rule that says in the event that happens again, you know, truncate it back to 255 characters based on this set of rules. So we can also, and this is one of the key things, we can also replay a migration as well. So if we replay a migration, we can actually unwind what's been migrated, make it as if it's brand new, and then start the migration again. We can provide business rules to make sure that, you know, whatever the issue was doesn't happen again. And that was what I just mentioned. Again, we can unwind and restart a migration with that new rule. In the event of a communication failure, which can be a network issue, remembering that these are long-running tasks. This is really important. Power failure or for any other reason, what will happen is that as each record is migrated, the system keeps track of what the last thing it did was and where it's up to in its, you know, process of migration. And what this means is that, and again, this is a lesson learned from experience. We learned that the weakness in a lot of customer sites when it comes to the migration, believe it or not, is actually the SQL engine. We can process, you know, thousands of records per hour without comms issues, without SharePoint issues, without, you know, connection from the machine that's doing the migration to SharePoint. But where we kept having a lot of issues was around the records manager's ability to process so many thousands of transactions in SQL. So again, that constitutes a failure, but it's sort of more of a soft failure because the system will notice the failure and then it'll actually wait for a period. It sort of treats it like a record lock, and then it goes back and it'll try that for up to 5 minutes before it'll decide that this is just hopeless. And then what it can do, by the way, is it can move on, but it'll just simply record that record as a communication failure. And it tries to give the SQL server on the back end at least an opportunity to recover. And it might also start to slow down the number of transactions and the complexity of what it's doing. Now, the downside of this is that it means that some migrations can take a little longer. The upside, of course, is it means that their success rate is infinitely higher. So let's have a look at deltas. These are basically the difference. That's a double entendre for anybody that didn't see it. Alternate structural changes in new sources, new records or updates to existing records are all handled by the migration tool. There's no need to stop your users from using your existing legacy record system while the migration is going on. We encourage them to keep doing it. Record keeping is essential. But what we want to do is we want to also know what we've done and then revisit what the changes are and make sure that our target system is up to date. We want to configure to allow the change records to be updated or completely replaced. So this is again a new feature that we've learned by doing it, and that is that sometimes when you want to update a record in the source repository, there's a reason why that update can't be migrated as an update. So what the system will do is it will try to do that, you know, synchronization exercise. If it can't do it, what it'll actually do is destroy the target record and then completely redo that record from the migration source, which means that when you eventually look at your migrated record set, you'll see that it is complete in every way. The deletion of, so this is an example of what we were just talking about. So if you delete a version from the source and then replace that with the current item, that would actually cause the migrated item to come out of sync with the master source record. It's a bit of an anomaly there, but what happens is that the way that SharePoint treats a current item against, as opposed to a versioned history item, and the way the record manager does that is actually completely different. So we've had to sort of tweak that a little bit to make sure that it works. Another example is the change of MIME type, and we talked about this a moment ago. So midway through the history of a record in your record management system, record manager system, SharePoint will only equate the current file to the extension type. So again, you might want to consider breaking that one up. So it migrates the current version and then migrates historical versions. That's important because it also sets the identity of the record. We're also talking about migrating bulk. So this is what we do. So we migrate the bulk of your records, and then we use the delta migration to finesse that result to make sure that everything's synced. And what this effectively allows you to achieve is that cutover date, when all of a sudden you'll say, look, the records have all been migrated, we've checked them all off, we've remediated the 10 that didn't work, and we've moved those manually, and now we're ready to cut over to our new SharePoint record keeping system. And of course, the alternates. Now, alternates are a big thing. Alternates can be pointed to the metadata or the record attachment, which allows consumption of the detail in a more friendly manner. Of course, with Records Manager, the way that it works, and I know that you already know this, is that you'll pull up a record and then you'll have an opportunity to view the attachments. With SharePoint, it's actually slightly different. SharePoint works on the assumption that everything is about the content. So it's about the attachment, the document. The problem that we have here is that for most part in record management, it could be that we're more interested in the attribute of the record than what's actually in it. Certainly as a record manager, that's what I'm more focused on. The issue becomes now, how do I want to view that record? Do I want to see it as the metadata, the attribute of the record, or do I want to see the content? Well, I think it depends on who you are. If you're the record manager, sure, it's all about the attributes. If you're the user, it's probably more about the actual record, the content of the record, the attachment. So what this allows us to do is it allows us to configure alternates specifically based on what the users actually want to see. And that's a really unique feature all on its own. And that pretty much concludes everything that I've got to say about this record keeping presentation today.
Wonderful, thanks Ian. Just going to jump into a few quick questions. We're running a bit short on time, so I'll only get to a couple of them. The first one here, Ian, is I have noticed that you selected a single site collection in the demonstration. Can the application process large numbers of records to different site collections?
Great question, Trevor. Yes, it can. There's absolutely no issue with doing that. Unfortunately, trying to compress what the records management sort of migration system does into a 13-minute video is really, really hard to do. But the reality at the end of the day is that you can nominate a single container of records or a single class of records to be migrated to a specific library in a site collection. And then the next group of containers or the next container from Record Manager, you might decide to put into a completely different container in SharePoint in a completely different site collection in a completely different library. The other alternative to that is you can also consolidate. So what we've done there is we've taken a consolidation and we've distributed it. The opposite of that is that we can take that distribution of records that exists in Record Manager and we can consolidate them in a final target as well. So it works both ways.
Perfect. And another one is, will this application work with Records Point Records 365?
The answer is yes, it will. The thing about Records Point is that Records Point is, an add-on or an overlay to an existing SharePoint infrastructure. What we're talking about is the part that gets the record from your legacy system through the transitional process into SharePoint. From there, things like Record Point or whatever record management system you choose to use can then take over. So effectively what we're talking about here is, and this is really sort of crude, but we're talking about using SharePoint as a data store, if you like, for those records. I think what becomes key in all of this understanding is that while Record Point and those other style of products that a bit of an overlay to SharePoint exist in the marketplace, the way that Microsoft is positioning record keeping in SharePoint really allows for a lot of the complexity, things like sensitivity, things like labeling, retention, even sentencing, destruction, certificate of destruction. All of these kinds of things are now starting to be managed really well in the native SharePoint environment. As is usually the case with these webinars, unfortunately we ran out of time. However, there were a number of questions that remained unanswered that were asked by the participants, and so we've added the answers to those questions here. So another question that's just come in: we don't want to lift and shift. Can we reorganize our record structure through this tool? And of course the answer is yes, we encourage it. Starting with a platform like Records Manager is not overly versatile. It's there to perform a task according to a specific function and a specific methodology, and it does that very well. However, as the years roll by, so it may become more appropriate to modify and change the structure of our record keeping system. And this is the opportunity to do that transformation and undertake that during the migration. Another question: can we use this tool within the federal government secure networks? Of course the answer is yes. The tool has been written to be self-contained, which means that it has no external requirements other than the connection to your existing record management system and a connection to the secure government's Microsoft 365 environment. And another question: can you provide some of the main issues we may face in migrating records, and what are the gotchas? This is a fairly broad question. A lot of the issues that we've encountered have come down to perhaps not so much the technical, physical aspects of the existing records, but more about how the users want to transition and transform those records to become of greater value to the users. Obviously, this requires a huge amount of consultation, touching with the different business units that have an input into the way the new structure might look. Usually creates some additional effort that needs to be addressed. Obviously competing interests, those kinds of things. So I'm going to suggest that the biggest gotcha is not planning appropriately for how your final environment will look and function is probably the key one. There are a lot of small technical ones that come back to again, transformation. The tool has been designed to handle a lot of these, but there's obviously going to be situations where the out-of-the-box business rule set may not be sufficient. So this allows us to identify where there are shortcomings and then provide customizations to suit those shortcomings, making sure, of course, that you get the best possible outcome. And a final question: how does the tool manage things like record ghosting or in-record relationships in SharePoint? And this is actually a really interesting question. It comes back to specifically experience. When we talk about ghosted records, or we talk about alternates, or we talk about these different types of record that really hang off a physical record, the way that we handle those with the migration tool when we're doing the transformation into Microsoft 365 is by providing a configurable manner that allows that ghosted record or that alternate record to be configured to appear to the user in such a way that it's either a direct link to the record or it's a ghosted version of the record. Now remember too that ghosted records can be read-only in the final transition. So again, it comes back to a definition of exactly what the user requires, and the tool is capable of having a ghosted or alternate record as a counterpart to a real physical record. It might be that it just represents a pointer to the record, but it can be located pretty much anywhere throughout Office 365. It doesn't need to be in the same site collection. It doesn't need to be in the same site or library. It can be basically anywhere else.
So is there anything else, mate? Is there anything else you want to cover off before we wrap up, Ian?
No, I'm good.
Wonderful. All right. Thank you all for your time. And before we say goodbye, though, I'd like to reinforce our belief that these migrations we've spoken about today, it's just the part of the first step to a complete digital transformation of your organisation. And we conduct regular webinars detailing next steps and features to boost your digital transformation adoption and efficiency. And we encourage you to follow us on LinkedIn and look for invites on LinkedIn and in your inbox. Thank you all. Take care and goodbye. And I promise the next one's going to be better.
Thanks, folks.
See ya.
Bye-bye.